Welcome, Margaret and Amanda.
Good evening. Welcome, bienvenidos, friends of the Hispanic Society, to the Tertulias de Arte Español. I would like to thank our members who have joined us this evening and joined us monthly, and welcome all of those of you who are new members and new friends of the museum watching for their first time. We continue these conversations on the first Tuesday of each month at 6 o'clock. If you're not a member yet, please do consider joining by going to our website at hispanicsociety.org and search for membership under support. This evening, I have the enormous pleasure of welcoming Amanda Raquel Dorval, a New Yorker Dominican artist, graduate student, and 7-year Air Force veteran, originally from Queens, New York. She received her BA in art history from Barnard College and is about to graduate with a master's in library and information science from Long Island University Post, with a concentration in archive management and rare books and special collections. As an Iraqi Arabic linguist in the Air Force, Ms. Dorval developed a passion for Arabic language and culture, which derives much of her current graduate research. At the Hispanic Society, she is working with us as a research fellow with support of the Rockefeller Brother Fund. And in addition, she's also a part-time bibliographer of Indigenous American art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Watson Library, as well as a part-time archive intern at the World Monument Fund. It's an enormous pleasure, Amanda, to welcome you this evening. I've so enjoyed working with you at the Hispanic Society, and I'm really, really excited to have this conversation with you. So I turn it over to you, Amanda.
Thank you, Margaret. Thanks for the introduction. And everybody, I'm assuming I'm being heard well enough. So again, thanks, Margaret, for the introduction, and for everybody for joining me here today as I talk about some really interesting cookery books from the Hispanic Society collection. This presentation will be an overview of some of the cookery books I have been examining during my research fellowship at the Hispanic Society Museum and Library. For my research project, I have been using the museum and library's collection of cookery books in order to explore the Middle Eastern influences existent within Spanish and Latin American food culture, with my focus being on pastry arts, or repostería. The ingredients that I have noticed, which have been prominent examples of this cross-cultural influence in Spanish and Latin American pastry arts, are cinnamon, sugar, dates, figs, almonds, and other spices, including nutmeg and clove. After spending so much time looking through the cookbook collection here at the Hispanic Society, I noticed that these ingredients reappear over and over in a wide variety of Spanish and Latin American cookbooks in both sweet and savory recipes. There are also many examples of how Middle Eastern cooking techniques have influenced Spanish and ultimately Latin American pastry arts, such as the frying and sugaring of dough. Think churros, for example. In short, many of the sweet treats traditional in Spanish and Latin American gastronomy have their roots in the Middle East. This isn't surprising, given that almost half of Spain was ruled by Muslim caliphs for almost 800 years, from 1711 to 1492. I would like to preface my talk by stating quite transparently that I am not a food historian, nor an expert in the history of Spain in general. In fact, I did not come into this research fellowship with any specific idea in mind of what I wanted to research. As a former Arabic language analyst in the United States Air Force, as Margaret mentioned, from 2013 to 2020, and as somebody with Puerto Rican and Dominican heritage, all I knew coming into my role here was that I wanted to utilize the collection and resources to explore the cultural links between Spain and the Middle East, and how those links also ultimately made their way into Latin America. As a library science student, I also wanted to ensure my project focused on books, manuscripts, or print culture in some way. When I randomly came across the cookbook collection on the Hispanic Society's website in search of ideas, it presented a serendipitous opportunity to examine such a cultural connection between Latin America and the Arab world. Since the website only features a small handful of cookbook examples, I was not at first aware of how extensive the Hispanic Society collection of cookery books actually is. In this tertulia, I will present some of the most important cookery books that are in the Hispanic Society collection, while tying aspects of my own research related to influence of the Arabs in Spanish gastronomy. It is my belief that these cookbooks deserve due recognition as unique objects which reflect the breadth and uniqueness of the museum's overall collection. Many of you listening today might be very familiar with some of the museum's star pieces, such as Francisco de Goya's Duchess of Alba, or the many monumental paintings surrounding the Sorolla room. But perhaps you are a little less familiar with some of these rare and impressive cookery books from early modern Spain. In this talk, I present three main examples of the Hispanic Society's manuscripts from the Hispanic Society's Manuscripts and Rare Books Department. Roberto de Nola's Libre del Coque from 1578, Diego Granado's Arte de Cocina from 1599, and a 1662 edition of Francisco Martinez Moutinhos Arte de Cocina, Pastelería, Bizcochería y Conservería, which was first printed in 1611. So here I think it would be a good idea to first give a brief overview of the cookbook collection at the Hispanic Society. So in this slide, you're just kind of seeing a really kind of random sampling of the books we have. Many of the oldest cookbooks in the Hispanic Society were part of a large purchase by Archer Huntington, the museum's founder, in 1902 of the important collection of books and manuscripts owned by the Marqués de Jerez de los Caballeros. Most of the modern cookbooks in the library were later donated in installments, beginning around 2009, by the museum's former director, Mitchell Cotting. In total, there are over 1,000 cookbooks in the Hispanic Society Library, both printed and in manuscript form, spanning from the 1500s through the 21st century, and hailing from all over Spain, the Caribbean, and the Americas. The earliest cookery book in the Hispanic Society collection is a 1503 edition of a work known by the abbreviated title Arte Cucinaria, composed in Latin by the Italian gastronomist Bartolomeo Platina in 1503, and that's what we're seeing in this slide here. Even without extensive reading knowledge of Latin, I noticed that the entry on sugar, which is pictured in this slide, acknowledges the Arab origin of sugar. The Hispanic Society's cookery books from Spain's early modern period include the three aforementioned heavy hitters, Libre del Coque by Roberto de Nola, Arte de Cocina by Diego Granado, and Arte de Cocina by Francisco Martínez Moutinhos. These three cookery books are among the most important in the history of Spanish and European gastronomy, and so the presence of this trio within the Hispanic Society Library is quite special. Though I have not been able to extensively compare the cookbook collection at the Hispanic Society with similar collections at other cultural institutions within the US or around the world, I am nonetheless aware that this collection is quite rare and most assuredly impressive. So we'll begin with the first of the three books that I mentioned, which is Libre del Coque. The shortened title is Libre del Coque by Roberto de Nola, which was first printed in 1520. And we have a 1578 edition at the Hispanic Society. Así comienza lo Libre de Cocina, also known as Libre del Coque, is one of the first cookery books ever published in Spain and the first to be published in Catalan. It was composed by Roberto de Nola, about whom not much is known. First printed in 1520, as I mentioned, this Hispanic Society copy is a later version that was printed in Barcelona by Pedro Malo in 1578. It was acquired by Archer M. Huntington for the Hispanic Society in 1904. It is bound in vellum, and the edges of the pages are stained red. The recipes themselves are written in Catalan and printed in Gothic typeface. The vellum binding has some discoloration as well as what appears to be fire damage along the right side. But the pages are in otherwise good condition. The title page includes a woodcut and engraved image, which you see in this slide. And according to the Hispanic Society website, quote, Roberto de Nola's Libre del Coque is an extremely rare book, with a copy held by the Hispanic Society being the only surviving exemplar of the 1578 edition. The first edition was published in 1520, of which there is only one known surviving copy, this one held by the Library of Catalonia. Between 1520 and 1578, it is probably edited or reprinted 7 times, but some have been entirely lost or only a few imperfect copies survive, end quote. An index of the book's over 200 recipes appears at the back, and that's what we're seeing in this slide. Some of the recipes from the index are seen here. The recipes span a variety of different dishes, including stews, soups, baked dishes, boiled dishes, simmered dishes, and sauces. There are also chapters that outline kitchen duties, proper ways in which to cut and serve food, medical advice, as well as Lent-friendly dishes. So I don't speak Catalan. It's similar to Spanish, so I was able to recognize within the book's recipes key ingredients of interest to my own research project, including cinnamon or canela, which I've marked here and digitally marked. No books were harmed during this tertulia. Sugar, sucre, nutmeg, and saffron. In this slide, I have outlined, again, digitally outlined some instances in which these words appear. So we're going to move on to the second book, Arte de Cocina by Diego Granado, which was first printed in 1599. Composed by Diego Granado and printed in Madrid by Luis Sanchez in 1599, Arte de Cocina is the first treatise on Spanish gastronomy composed in the Spanish language. So the book prior was written in Catalan. This is the first book written in Spanish. It is somewhat of a controversial treatise, as prior research has pointed out how Granado has, in the words of some scholars, plagiarized prior works such as Roberto de Nola's Libre del Coque from 1520 and Del Arte de Cucinare, on the art of cooking, written by the Italian chef Bartolomeo Scappi in 1570. However, there are also some scholars who believe that the title of plagiarist is perhaps too harsh. As an admirer of de Nola, it makes sense that Granado would have been inspired by him for his own work. Also, Granado does not simply cut and paste the recipes of de Nola or Scappi. He transferred material over in such a way that adapts ingredients to suit more local availability. He alters recipe ingredients according to his own taste. He eliminates seasonal references, translates names of ingredients to Spanish, and revises recipe information. In short, Granado adapts recipes and makes them his own, and it is imprudent to simply label him a plagiarist. Furthermore, the readers of Granado would have likely been able to recognize the influence of his predecessors, whose cookbooks were well established. The copy of Arte de Cocina in the Hispanic Society is bound in vellum, and only one of the 2 leather hoops used to close the book remains. And you can kind of see that in the picture here. You see one of those loops still there. The edges of the text block are stained red, and the title Arte de Cocina can be found on the book's spine. The pages are in relatively good condition, but some of the pages at the end have become detached from the binding. In this book, too, there are sections on various kitchen duties, such as sharpening knives, serving food, and cutting meat, recipes for sick people, and other recipes. There is an index at the back of the book which contains over 600 recipes for various stews, soups, sauces, desserts, baked dishes, meatballs, empanadas, egg dishes, so much more. And we're seeing in this slide a picture of some of those recipes in the index. So one of the first things I noticed about this book when I opened it is the handwritten note on the inside front cover, which attests to the book's rarity. And in this picture, in this slide, you can see that handwritten note there. It is a note from the Marqués de Jerez de los Caballeros, who I mentioned earlier, who sold this book among thousands of other books and manuscripts to Archer Huntington in 1902. And in this slide, you also see a portrait that was painted by Sorolla that is also in the Hispanic Society collection. The collection that the Marqués sold to Huntington was one of the most important collections in Spain, and it now makes up the backbone of the Hispanic Society's library. I've translated his note, his handwritten note, with a little help from Vanessa Pintado, my supervisor at the Hispanic Society, as only one other example of this book is known, which is in the library at the Royal Spanish Academy in Madrid. This is the only one that is complete. The other one is missing various pages. So the catalog entry of Arte de Cocina at the Royal Spanish Academy Library that the Marquez was talking about actually reveals that it holds 2 copies, not one, as the Marquez noted. The first copy at the Royal Spanish Academy is indeed missing pages, though the catalog entry for the second page does not annotate any pages missing. It could be that the second one is a complete copy, or that it simply wasn't cataloged fully to account for missing pages. Nonetheless, whether or not there is actually a second complete example of Granado's Arte de Cocina at the Royal Spanish Academy Library, the one in the Hispanic Society still presents itself as quite a rare specimen. Granado's Arte de Cocina presents many examples of recipes influenced by the presence of Arabs in Spain. Sugar and cinnamon, for example, are mentioned repeatedly throughout. Here I am presenting but one example of a recipe that highlights the influence of Arabs: preserved dates. The date fruit is one of the many ingredients that was introduced to Spain by the Moors, and which would eventually be introduced into the Americas by the Spanish conquistadores. I have translated the recipe into English with help from Vanessa, and compared it with a date recipe found in a Baghdad cookery book, which is a translation by food historian Charles Perry of the Arabic cookbook Kitab al-Tabikh, or the Book of Dishes, which was composed in the 13th century by a scribe commonly referred to as el-Baghdadi. So my disclaimer here is that I am not stating definitively that Granado took this recipe from el-Baghdadi's Kitab al-Tabikh. I have not done that particular research, and I can't say that with any certainty what source Granado used here. I am merely pointing out the similarities between the 2 recipes as a way of highlighting cross-cultural food influences between the Middle East and Spain. So again, this is my translation for preserved dates. Take the desired amount of dates and remove the pits. Make a hole through the stalk and 4 or 5 punctures all around. For 3 pounds of dates, take 4 pounds of sugar and clarify them well. From the 4 pounds of sugar, save 2 for later, and put 2 pounds of sugar with the 3 pounds of dates in water in bowls. Take the well-washed dates and toss them to cook them in the clarified sugar, cooking them until the sugar thickens. Then take them off the fire and leave them overnight in the sugar water mixture. In the morning, take the other 2 pounds of remaining sugar and add it to the mixture, cooking it until it thickens, forming a coat. Add a little bit of rose water or sugar water and serve as desired. So again, I'm comparing that recipe with the recipe for honey dates, el-Baghdadi's recipe for honey dates in Kitab al-Tabikh, again from the book, or translated as the Book of Dishes from the 13th century. And this is not my translation. This English translation was done by Charles Perry, a food historian that I mentioned a little bit earlier. Take syrup-soaked, fresh harvested rutab dates and spread them out in the shade and the air for a day. Take them and remove their pits. Then take 2 pounds of honey for every 10 pounds of dates and boil it on the fire with 2 ounces of rose water. When they are cold, sprinkle them with finely pounded sugar. And I kind of abbreviated that a little bit there. Again, I can't outright say that Granado's recipe for preserved dates was directly influenced by el-Baghdadi's Kitab al-Tabikh, but the similarities are interesting to consider in a larger conversation about Arab food influences in Spain. In particular here, the soaking of dates in sugar water, and specifically the use of rose water, is the most intriguing similarity, because rose water was also introduced into Spain during the Muslim conquest. In addition, the fact that Granado's recipe does not call for all the same ingredients in el-Baghdadi's recipe, such as saffron, musk, or camphor, is also interesting to consider in a larger dialogue about how cookbook scribes would adapt their recipes to suit local tastes, available ingredients, or other local food customs. And so now we're moving on to the third book, Arte de Cocina, Pastelería, Bizcochería y Conservería by Francisco Martínez Moutinho, first published in 1611. A bequest of Archer M. Huntington to the Hispanic Society of America in 1956, Arte de Cocina is a cookery book composed by Francisco Martínez Moutinho, first printed in 1611 in Madrid. The Hispanic Society actually has two copies of this book, a 1611 first edition and a 1662 reprint. The one I'm presenting here today is the 1662 copy, so not the original, which is bound in vellum with the title of the book on its spine. Francisco Martínez Moutinho was the head chef to the Spanish king in the early modern period, a royal chef in the courts of Felipe II, the third and the fourth. The book is divided into two parts. The first part lays out instructions in order to maintain proper kitchen hygiene, including the cleaning of utensils and the care of the table. Beginning a cookery treatise with some best practices in kitchen cleanliness is a trait that exemplifies later cookery books in Spain and Latin America, as well as other cookbooks from other parts of Europe, and one which can also be traced to medieval Arabic cookery books as well. The second part of the book is dedicated to the presentation of nearly 500 recipes in various areas of savory dishes, pastry arts, and fruit preserves. There is an index at the end of the book with the recipes arranged alphabetically. The recipes span a wide variety of rice dishes, stews, meatballs, oils, cakes, bunuelos, eggplant dishes, empanadas, desserts, egg dishes. There's a lot, as you can tell, and other savory dishes. Of most interest to me for my research project, many of Moutinho's recipes demonstrate clear ties to the Middle East, which is reflective of the Arab legacy of Spain's 800-year period of Islamic rule. And in line with other printed books at this time, included in the preliminary leaves, that is the beginning leaves of the book, the beginning pages of the book, of Arte de Cocina is a licencia, an approval license that was given by the king, usually on his behalf by a royal escribano or clerk. In this 1662 edition, the licencia was given by Miguel Fernández de Noriega and addressed to Manuel López, the bookseller, that stipulated the terms of printing and selling of this particular edition. The licencia of the 1662 edition confirms that Moutinho's work had been printed several times prior, stating, quote, que otra veces ha sido impreso, and que la dicha impresión se haga conforme al original, end quote, which basically says that it's been printed several times and that this version conforms to the original version. Since it was first published in 1611, it has actually been reprinted more than 25 times, evidence that it has remained popular over time. In fact, Moutinho's Arte de Cocina is recognized as, quote, the most published Spanish cookbook before the 21st century, and that's a quote by Carolyn Nadeau. It is a very important book in the context of food history within Spain and its colonies, and in fact, it is the most comprehensive recipe book of Hispanic modernity. The licencia is also interesting to keep in mind within the book's historical context, the period following the Spanish Reconquista. This was a time of increasing intolerance in Spain, during which the Catholic monarchy was prohibiting the expression of various Muslim cultural markers, such as clothing, language, Islamic religious practices, and food customs. Even couscous, our traditional Moorish dish, wasn't safe from persecution. Curiously, even though the cultural traditions of those who inspired the recipes in Moutinho's cookbook were subjected to censoring and eradication efforts by the Catholic monarchy, Moutinho's recipes themselves nonetheless pay homage to many of the Arab culinary traditions that were introduced into Spain during the period of Islamic rule. In fact, the presence of the licencia within the preliminary leaves means that all of the content within the book was given a sort of official stamp of approval. Arte de Cocina also includes 2 couscous recipes, one of the only cookery books at the time to do so. As I just mentioned, Moutinho's Arte de Cocina was republished over 25 times, with later editions printed well into the 20th and 21st centuries. Diego Granado's Arte de Cocina, by contrast, which was the second book I talked about, was not as commercially successful, perhaps overshadowed by the popularity of his successor, Moutinhos. One interesting contributing factor in this situation can be found in Moutinhos' prologue. In his prologue, Moutinhos flat out called out the inferiority of Granado's work, and he stated, and this is a quote translated from Spanish by Carolyn Nadeau. My intention in writing this little book has been that no books can be found that guide those who serve in the office of the kitchen and who have recorded all by memory. I have seen only one, and it is so flawed that whoever uses it will be ruined. It is composed by an official that hardly anyone at this court knows. Things in the book are not organized in a way that any apprentice could use to his advantage, at least Spaniards, who, if they follow it, would err and ruin their fortune, end quote. Though Moutinhos doesn't refer to Granado by name, the inference is clear. And from this book, I have chosen to highlight one of the 600 recipes, and it's a recipe for Bunuelos de Viento, or crispy, airy fritters made of wheat-based yeast dough that are traditionally thinly rolled or formed into individual balls and then finished with a sweet topping such as sugar or syrup. There are 7 different recipes for buñuelos in Moutinhos Arte de Cocina, 3 of which can be seen in this slide. I have translated the first recipe, which is the one on the left page, with a little help by Vanessa, again, my supervisor. Take sifted wheat flour, about ½ pound, and dissolve it with cold water and a little salt. Make a dough as if you were making hostias or wafers. Afterwards, heat a little lard in a pan as if you were making an omelet. And when it is hot, throw the batter into the pan. Toss it using a ladle over a hot fire, and the batter will become waxy. Cook it well, constantly tossing it so that it does not stick to the pan or form a crust. When the dough is cooked, throw it in the almires, a type of mortar and pestle, grinding it very well and adding eggs little by little. Grind it well until it is soft. Be sure that only half of the eggs contain the egg white, the other half just egg yolks, so that they don't fluff up too much and then become cracked. Pass the buñuelos through almíbar or syrup, then top them with a little ground cinnamon. Make the buñuelos large, since these are the best type that can be made. That sounds really yummy to me. So on this slide, I have 2 very modern images of buñuelos. So this is not something that would have appeared in this book. But at this point, I have compared this recipe for buñuelos with a recipe for a type of fried dough found in the Arabic cookbook Kitab al-Tabikh by al-Baghdadi from the 13th century, which is the book I referred to earlier. This recipe is called Luqam al-Qadi. And again, there's a picture on the right of a modern version of that. Here again, as with the previous recipe comparison, I am not claiming that there is a direct A to B correlation between Moutinhos' recipe and al-Baghdadi's recipe. In fact, the history of fried dough in particular goes back many millennia, and it's one of those universal dishes in which many cultures have long developed some form of this delicious treat. However, it seems that in the case of Spain, the technique of frying dough and then topping it with sugar, cinnamon, or syrup may have been brought over by the Moors, the Arabs. The buñuelos specifically may have been invented by the Arabs, and these fried treats were known to have been eaten among Spain's Morisco population, the Muslim converts. Here, al-Baghdadi's recipe is quite succinct. There should be, not my translation, by the way, this is from Charles Perry. There should be strength in the dough of this variety. When it ferments, take pieces the size of hazelnut and fry them in sesame oil. Then dip them in syrup and sprinkle finely pounded sugar on them. So as I wind down my presentation, I want to quickly present a couple of quick bonus images I shot of a later, much later Spanish printed cookbook, Arte de Repostería, or the Art of Pastry Making, composed by Juan de la Mata in 1747. This book contains several foldouts illustrating various elaborate table displays, and I think that it's a good visual example of how these early these early cookery books contain much more than just recipes for food dishes. So this concludes my presentation on 3 very important cookery books from Spain's early modern period. For anyone who is interested in knowing more specific details about these books, I recommend looking up the work of Dr. Caroline Nadeau, who I referenced multiple times in this presentation. Dr. Nadeau is a professor of Hispanic studies at Illinois Wesleyan University, whose research focuses on food representation in 16th and 17th century Spanish literature. She has written many books and articles on the cookbooks I've presented here today, with much more expertise than I possess. And I also recommend looking up the work of Charles Perry, who I also referenced in my talk today, especially for the Arabic translations from Arabic to English. And thank you all for listening. That concludes my presentation.
Wow, thank you, Amanda. That was really terrific. I learned a lot from this. I feel like I'm getting hungry for some of those bunuelos.
And I also recommend looking up the work of Charles Perry, who I also, oops, sorry about that.
I was really happy to see that you also showed the bindings, because I feel like, you know, these cookbooks must have an interesting life, and it's wonderful to see kind of the handling, even the wares. I mean, you mentioned that one may have been damaged from fire, and I just kind of evokes this kind of image of how that might have happened, if it happened in the kitchen. Sort of really kind of interesting.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting thought, that it might have happened in the kitchen. I would have no idea, and I think that goes back to just my background as a library student and somebody interested in rare books. As a bibliographer, I love describing the physical aspects of these books, because they do tell the book's history. They do.
Absolutely. Only if they could tell us what those histories were, right? One thing, I just thinking about kind of current recipe books, and I think about, how I use recipes today and how they differ from what we're seeing now. And I just wondered if you could speak a little bit about both how recipes are presented and what you notice was different from how we use recipe books today. I mean, I saw a lot of kind of in-depth reading, no illustrations. Yeah. I mean, I'm a cook who likes to see what is this supposed to look like after I make it. But I just was wondering if you could comment a little bit on differences of what you saw as you read through these books.
Absolutely. And I think, as you mentioned, one of the biggest differences is that it's just these huge, giant blocks of text. When I need a recipe, I go on Pinterest, and there's this whole blog and, life story and a fairy tale that goes along with the images, and, the ingredients are laid out, specific amounts of things you need. And that's not something that really appears in these early cookery books. Those sorts of things develop much later, as the cookbook itself develops through time and across different countries. I don't know when those changes happened. I don't know when people started adding illustrations to recipes, or exactly when exact measurements were listed before the steps. But that is one of the major differences I noticed. It's just kind of one giant block of text that might tell you how much of an ingredient to use, but it's really within the block of the text. You have to read as you go, and it's not really presented at the beginning. And I think part of that is, I'm not an expert in this, but one of the things I think is that, before the development and evolution of cookery books, recipes were really passed on orally, whether it's in an apprenticeship in like the royal kitchen, or from generation to generation in a household. And I think that kind of really informs the way some of those recipes are developing, and leaving out big pieces of information, or even little things that might seem second nature to the people who were reading this at the time. So that was the biggest thing I noticed.
Yeah, I mean, it seems almost like these were meant for people who had experience in cooking, that may have just were looking for direction on kind of combining different types of foods. to sort of what to do with them. I mean, I think you raise a good point that the lack of kind of the measurements is very interesting. I mean, I actually was really intrigued by the image in the Juan de la Mata's Arte de Repostería, because I do decorative arts, and it's really fun for us. I mean, we see these plates and different types of objects that we have in the museum collection, but we rarely kind of see how they were placed on a table. So to see them in a cookbook is really fantastic, and how they may have been used, and how certain types of dishes were used for very specific types of food. So I really appreciated that. But going back to the idea, of the cookbook and the lack of measurements and things, I mean, who used these cookbooks? I mean, there clearly were people who had experience, but who had access to them. It wasn't for someone who was just decided to make bunuelos, or, I mean, was it for the everyday person? I mean, obviously you needed to be literate. You needed to be prepared to read these long texts and to kind of delve in. But were these cookbooks available to everyone, or they were just kind of the court kitchen?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I admit that I don't know the exact answer to that, but I do have some theories. And at least with the third book I talked about, the Francisco Martinez Moutinho book, he was a royal chef in at least three major courts, or the courts of three major kings. So his book would have been geared towards people who also cooked, other chefs, other royal chefs, other chef apprentices. But it's interesting also to consider the fact that that particular book was printed over 25 times for like centuries. So it wasn't just limited. At some point, it was getting into the hands of everyday people too, that span different generations even. I don't know the exact reasons behind that, but it's definitely interesting to consider that even though this book was intended for the professional chef, it eventually does make its way into everyday people's hands. Whether or not they were using that specific book, for instance, or some of these books I talked about, they probably wouldn't have had all the access to the ingredients. That's also something else to consider. So even if the everyday person was reading these things, they would likely have had to sort of alter the recipes with ingredients that they could have, that they could access easily. And the Juan de la Mata book, the one that I didn't talk about, I wish I had more time, and I would have. But those illustrations of those setups also kind of speaks to the fact that a lot of these books were geared towards the court and the monarchy and people who were very rich.
And what about, I mean, more specific, you mentioned one book, and I don't think it's in our collection, but the Book of Dishes by, and I'm not going to pronounce it correctly, but I wonder if you could just give a little more detail on that. I just thought that was so fascinating. And was that a book that the chefs would have had in the kitchen? I mean, how did that come to influence, or what can you share about that particular book and its influence on, or access to that particular book?
So the Kitab al-Tabikh, or we can just call it the Book of Dishes. That's the English translation, and it's known as that. So that is an Arabic cookbook from 13th century. So it's not in the Hispanic Society collection, because I don't know if that's within the scope, to be honest, of what we do here. And actually, I don't know if Granado or Moutinho would have had access to that. The biggest difference between the early Arabic cookbooks, and I should also make a point to say that Arabic cookbooks predate the Spanish language ones. In fact, I think one of the earliest surviving known cookbook manuscripts is an Arabic cookbook. So I think the Arabs borrowed it from the Persians, and then, not being an expert in this field, I don't know the full trajectory of that, but the Arabs really made the act of writing down recipes their own. And obviously that made its way into Spain and really everywhere in the world. So I don't know how much access these Spanish cooks would have had to that, because they were manuscripts. So the books I'm talking about today were printed books. And as we know, with printing press and how that allows for mass production of text, would have made these sorts of books much more accessible than, say, a manuscript that is something written by hand or copied by hand, which is pretty much what all the Arabic cookbooks were. They were all handwritten manuscripts. So an interesting kind of fact to try to look into for my research is how maybe Granada or how Moutinho were. Did they have access to these sorts of Arabic treatises, handwritten treatises? Were they influenced by it? I don't know. And that's something to definitely research further.
Great. I have a ton of more questions, but I'm going to actually ask Laura if we have any questions from our audience.
Hi, so we do have a few. The
Cool.
first question is from William, and he wants to know if you have contacted any of the restaurants in Madrid that claim to serve historical dishes like Posada de la Villa or Botín.
Oh, that's such an interesting question. I have not. There are so many different aspects of this research that I wish I had time really to kind of to look into more, like contacting restaurants in Spain or even traveling to Spain to some of the library collections there. Because especially like Andalusia or Granada, which were heavily influenced more, I'm not an expert, so I don't want to say most or more heavily, but definitely heavily influenced by the Arabs. But that is such an interesting thing to try to keep in mind. I want to say that food itself is it really brings out a very visceral reaction from people. And one of the aspects I'm kind of exploring in my research here at the Hispanic Society is the role that nationalism and national identity also plays in like food and dishes. And again, not being a food historian, it's hard for me to know what dish came from exactly where, or even if those things are really known. I think there might be a lot of gray area in some of these things. But I'm not going to speak about one dish specifically, but I do know that there can be times when somebody claims something is, a Spanish dish when it might have really strong influences from something else, or a lot of different influences from things. And it's not wrong to say that it's a Spanish dish, because what happens is they take these influences and recipes and really make them Spanish by adapting them to local ingredients and food customs. So definitely something to keep in mind. But no, I have not contacted any restaurants, to kind of quickly answer that question.
We have another question from a viewer. Have you looked at any later works from Mexico, early 19th century, that help to trace the advent of Middle Eastern influences in fundamental Mexican cuisine?
I love that question. Yes, I have. I've looked at so many cookbooks during my fellowship. It's not even funny. It took me a long time just to figure out which 2 or 3 to talk about. And I settled on these 3 because they're so important in the history of cookbooks, gastronomy, not just in Spain, but everywhere. But yes, I've looked at several older, or later, I should say, books from Mexico. I've looked at cookbooks from even later in Puerto Rico and Dominican Republic, trying to kind of trace some of those influences. Interestingly, I think the Hispanic Society, the cookbook collection at the Hispanic Society, is mostly made up of Mexican cookbooks. Don't quote me on that, but at least a big portion of them do come from Mexico. And a lot of the recipes, I'd have to go back and kind of do that proper research, but I don't know if they're word for word kind of copies of the recipes I talked about, like from the books I talked about today, but they're definitely the same sorts of recipes. And like Spanish food is known to have Arab influence, Mexican food, it's the same. There are kind of Arab influences everywhere you look in Mexican cuisine. So I wish I had time to present some of the Mexican cookbooks I looked at. Maybe in the future I could do a separate talk on some of the Latin American books, but very interesting question. I love that question.
We also have a question if the print collection of the Hispanic Society have images of these recipes, even if the dates of the prints are much later than the original books.
So in these early, like the ones that I talked about today, these really early ones, no, there wouldn't be many images except maybe the occasional like etching or something that really didn't have to do with any of the dishes themselves. But in later cookbooks, there are definitely images. There are some of the cookbooks from like the 20th and 21st century, some really modern ones that do have accompanying accompanying, that's a difficult word, images for the dishes. But again, those are really, really modern. I don't know if I answered the question exactly. I hope I did. If not, definitely challenge me on that one.
Amanda, another viewer is asking if you have ever tried any of these recipes yourself.
No, I actually was just thinking about that. I want to say this past week, the buñuelos that I talked about. I was like, I think I want to try to make buñuelos. My biggest thing right now is just time. As Margaret mentioned in my intro, I do have several things going on. I have different part-time positions in different locations, and I have a 2-year-old son. So it's hard to find the time to make some of these recipes. But even if I'm not, I know that there are people out there actually using these older cookery books and trying to make those recipes. It is on my list of things to do, especially some of the buñuelos. But these are the 3 books, especially that I talked about today, are really, they're big, they're heavy hitters. So they're well researched, and not even just by food historians, but people who just love just love food. And there are those out there who are definitely trying to make these recipes in the Arabic cookbooks as well.
We have one more question.
Sure.
Is, have you looked into how economics were influenced by the spice trade?
Oh, that is an excellent question. No, I have not yet, but it's definitely crossed my mind, and I'm writing that down right now. No, and it's interesting to consider, because a lot of times, or even in this presentation, when I say, sugar comes from the Arabs, or cinnamon comes from the Arabs, again, as not a food historian, I haven't traced all of these ingredients exactly. But a lot of times, like take rice, for example, which isn't really one of the big ingredients, because I'm focusing more on pastry arts, and rice is obviously more of a savory thing, although it is used in some sweet dishes. Rice, I do believe, like the earliest origins come from China. And when we talk about things like the spice trade, and kind of the moving of these ingredients, obviously rice somehow made its way from China to the Middle East. But when it was introduced into Spain, it was because of the Arabs. So even if something like rice isn't necessarily 100% of Arab origin, the fact that it made its way into Spain is because of the Arabs. And ultimately that is due to stuff like the spice trade. So an interesting question, not one that I have a great answer to, but it is a good reminder to really kind of focus on that as I finalize my research for this fellowship.
So Amanda, I'm glad that you raised rice, because rice is one of these foods that we see in so many different parts of the world, and what we do with rice and how it's prepared. I mean, I have a friend from Iran who makes this wonderful rice that's kind of has the kind of, they fry it on the bottom, and it reminded me when I was, reminds me of when I was living in Dominican Republic, and they have the con,
yeah,
specialty. So there's so many interesting overlaps, and it would be really interesting. I think you're kind of made us really think about all of these different traditions that have influences from so many different parts of the world. And I really hope, I mean, I've learned so much, and I feel like you and I should chat more, because
Definitely.
I work on the dishes that are serving these.
Absolutely.
And so that would be really fun. But I think also, I hope anyone who's out there listening this evening and thinking of research projects, I mean, we really clearly have so many great areas to research and opportunities to research in the collection. And I hope food and cookbooks, this talk inspires you all out there to research it or use it as part of your research in other areas. So as you study history or art, that you think of this area as well.
Definitely.
So Amanda, thank you so much.
Thank you.
This has been such a great tertulia this evening, and I do hope you come back so we could look at some more of these cookbooks or other areas. I think it's such a rich no pun intended, rich topic. And I also want to thank the Rockefeller Brother Fund for helping bring us to the Hispanic Society. We really have enjoyed having you and look forward to all the research that you're doing while you're at the Hispanic Society and beyond. And the fellowship program for all of you out there is also supported not just by the Rockefeller Brother Fund, but also by the Queen Sofia Spanish Institute and the Herbert and Muriel Goldschmidt. It's really been such a wonderful program for us this year to have wonderful fellows, including Amanda. We have another fellow coming to speak with us on June 7th for the next Tertulia. And she will be, it's Anya Andreva, and she'll be talking about the Montón de Manila. And she has been working in conservation, so working specifically on textiles. So thank you, Amanda, and thank you everyone out there, and have a wonderful evening. And we look forward to seeing everyone come back. Good night.
Thank you, everyone.